Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Gray Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. I'm Kostas, and back with me again, as always, is Andrew. Andrew, hello.
It is great to be back again. It's always so much fun to make these podcasts.
It's a truly riveting experience, and we
Yeah.
hope that you out there who are listening to us are having just as much fun as we are talking about all these things.
It seems kind of unlikely, though. I mean, who could have as much fun as we have? They can try. They can certainly try.
They can try, sure, absolutely, and we encourage that very much. So we've got a very interesting topic today, and that is how to use conversational Latin in the classroom. And just by saying that, I know right now I've startled some people, because I think when you hear a phrase like that, for a lot of people, one of the first things that goes off in your mind is you're not quite sure where to begin.
I don't know what you're talking about, Kostas. It's just not possible to speak Latin conversationally. Everybody knows that.
Or so I'm told. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things we like to do here, in addition to informing and entertaining, is debunking myths. And that has got to be at the top of the list of myths that needs to be debunked. Yes, you can use conversational Latin in the classroom. And fortunately, you've clicked on, or however you reached us today, you've managed to log on to the right program to hear exactly how to do it. So why don't we begin by talking a little about how teachers can make use of conversational Latin in the classroom. And, as I was just alluding to a moment ago, I think a lot of people just feel like it's overwhelming in a sense. There's nowhere to begin, so they don't bother trying. But as I have found with many things in life, it's always a good idea to start with the simplest things. So probably, I think, the best bet for teachers wanting to teach their students conversational Latin is to begin with very small introductory phrases.
Yeah, I totally agree.
What would be some examples of this, Andrew? What do you think?
Well, I think in any language, when somebody's learning any language, the first words they learn are the words for hello and goodbye. And I would honestly recommend that teachers start using those on the first day of Latin class, whenever that is. Just teach the students salve, salvete, vale, valete. I mean, by the time you're using conversational Latin with them, they should already know that pretty darn well.
Yeah. And, there's a good chance that that's already going on in a lot of Latin classrooms. I have at least seen that much to a certain degree. And, I'm reminded actually last week they were rerunning on Jeopardy, the teachers tournament. And this year we had one of our own in the finals, a Latin teacher from Kentucky, I believe she was. And they get a certain period to give a shout out to all their students and all their family and everything. And I remember her saying to everyone, I just want to give a big salvete to all my students, which was fun to hear that said over a nationally broadcast game show like that.
Well, I'm happy to hear she's speaking at least one word in Latin. And,
Yeah.
I hope she's doing more than that. I mean, I think that more Latin teachers need to be venturing into conversational Latin in the classroom. And as you said, the key is to be very simple in the beginning. Use simple phrases. So not just salve and vale, but also simple questions like quid novi, meaning what's happening, what's up. And the student can then be taught to respond to that in a number of different ways. Kostas, how would you respond to quid novi?
So there are lots of things you could say. Common answers are, well, nothing's going on. You might say nihil novi, or you might say a little bit's going on, paucum novi, or you might say a lot's happening, multum novi.
Yeah, these are very short sentences, very easy to remember, and students really enjoy being able to do this. So if you can teach them some simple stuff right in the beginning, what normally happens is they get really excited about doing it, and then it isn't difficult to teach them more. They're interested in using Latin as a spoken language. I mean, I found almost every student wants to do that. You can also ask them a question like quid agis or ut vales. And how would the student maybe respond to that, Kostas?
So I love the set of answers for this. So students can say, I'm doing great, optime, or they might say, I'm all right, bene sum, or they might say, I'm not doing so well, male, or maybe they're caught in between and they say et bene et male, so, both good and bad.
Absolutely, or maybe valeo bene or valeo male, if they want to get a little bit more complicated. But the key, as we said, is to just be simple in the beginning. Start simply, work a lot on that before you move on to the next step. And so I have a question for you, Kostas. We're talking about conversational Latin, but in the beginning, when you're teaching students how to do this, is this a true conversation?
No, and so that's a little bit of a misnomer. And again, that's one of the things that probably puts some people off when they first hear it. So you can't walk before you crawl. So you can't really have a conversation in the beginning. It's not conversational when you first start. You're really just asking very simple questions and answers. And for quite a long time, actually, because, well, we'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but there has to be a period of adjustment. There has to be a retraining of sorts, getting students used to speaking the Latin language. And as we'll also mention in a little bit from now, Latin and English are quite different in the way they approach this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the key in the beginning is for the teacher to ask questions and then to teach the students how they need to answer those questions, and then very gradually change things. So a simple question can be changed into a slightly different simple question, which can be changed into a slightly different simple question. And then the students should be encouraged to come up with a reasonable answer for that question. So you should definitely start with simple sentences. After you've gotten through these very simple questions and answers that are pretty much the same every single time, you should move into questions and answers that are somewhat unique, even though they follow a somewhat set format. Yeah. So, very obvious questions might be quid est or quae sunt. So I might ask quid est and then point at something in the classroom. And then the student would have to give me an answer. So I might ask, quid est, and point to my head. And Kostas, what should the student respond to that?
Hopefully the student will say caput est.
Right. So if this is a smart student, the student will say caput est.
Or a good guesser. You never know.
Right. Whatever. But I could also ask quae sunt. And maybe I point at a couple books. What should the student answer, Kostas?
With all hope, once again, the student will say libri sunt.
Mm-hmm. And so these are questions and answers, sentences with very simple grammar, although there is some grammar that the student needs to be aware of. But the point in the beginning is you're just getting students used to the idea of using the language in a spoken context. You're not throwing a whole bunch of complicated grammar at them. That is,
if we could,
really, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you here. I just wanted to say, if we could, let's take a moment to further define what we mean by a simple sentence. So these sentences really should not exceed maybe 2 or 3 words to start out. Would it be fair to say that?
I would say that you should wait a while before you go to 3 words.
Okay.
You should stick with 2 words for quite a long time.
3 is just living on the edge, so we'll dial it back a little.
Well, you really have to go step by step with this, because this will be a brand new experience for the students. Mm-hmm. They will be a little bit shocked by this because they just won't be used to it. And so you got to get them used to it very gradually. And I say the questions quid est and que sunt, you should use those for a long time before
forever,
you
really.
Well, okay, you keep on using them, definitely, but you should stick with those and nothing else for quite a while until you feel that the students have mastered that question and answer combination. And what you want to do is you just want to use as much vocabulary as possible with those very simple questions. So you ask quid est or que sunt, but you point to many different things around the classroom. Or you might have a visual aid that has pictures on it, and you can point to those. But the key is keep the grammar really simple in the beginning. And then when the students are ready, and you'll know when they're ready, add just a tiny bit more complexity to it. So maybe you then go to 3 words.
And this is the other great thing about this for anyone who thinks this might get old after a while or it might get stale. Well, when we were talking about our introductory phrases a few minutes ago, there were a number of ways to answer those questions. And Latin being the language that it is, where you can answer things in many different ways and use many different words, you never run out of ways to say things. So don't worry about that aspect of it if that's something that's a potential concern. As we were saying, for example, ut vales, you could answer that in any number of ways. Vale o bene, or just bene, or, things like this.
Right. And maybe the more conservative students will stick with the stock answers, but the more adventurous ones will try their hardest to come up with new, unique answers. There will always be students who want to do that. Now, you want to stick with those 2-word questions for quite a while, but then at a certain point, you need to maybe go to 3-word questions and eventually even to 4-word questions. And when you start doing this, there's another aspect of teaching students spoken Latin that you need to introduce. And that is the word order aspect. And maybe Kostas, you might want to talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely, yeah. The first thing that people need to realize, of course, is that Latin word order is almost always, we can't say always because there are exceptions here, but almost always not English word order. Putting that in more concrete terms, we're talking about subject, verb, object is English word order, whereas Latin word order is more commonly subject, object, verb, with a number of other things thrown in. So the first goal there is to get the student disengaged from that English word order that they are so used to because they're presumably native English speakers, or they may not be actually, but that's different as well. You have to get them used to the Latin word order where the verbs are almost always coming at the ends of the sentence. So this takes time in and of itself just to get the students out of that comfort zone, I call it, this comfort zone and they'll want to revert to English word order. And you may as well. It happens to all of us every now and again. I've certainly tried to eliminate it more, but it does happen. And you have to fight against that. You just have to resist. And eventually you're retraining your brain to get away from that. And so that's one of those larger hurdles that needs to be overcome as well in the course of doing this.
Well, I would go one step further with this. And I would say that even though clearly Latin often has a subject, object, verb, word order, often it doesn't.
Right.
So subject, object, verb can actually be in any order in a sentence. And one of my goals, as soon as we've gotten to 3 or 4 word sentences, is to mix those words up as much as I possibly can, to put them in as many different orders as I possibly can. And if you do that constantly, the students get used to the idea that it doesn't have to do with word order,
right?
That it's about the endings on the words, not the word order. And my attitude is the earlier you dispel the notion that this is like English, the easier it will be for students to learn Latin as it actually is. And, I have to say that there are certain textbooks that I dislike a lot.
Oh, really? Do tell.
Yeah, because what they do is they pretend that Latin is English. And
emphasis on the word pretend there.
Right, even though it isn't. And for a very long time, and I'm sure many listeners of this show will know which textbooks I'm talking about, because it's actually more than one in which they do this. But they will put the sentences in English word order, teaching the students that this is how Latin is. And then what happens is they never really understand how the endings work. And they never get used to using the endings to determine the role that a word has in the sentence.
Right.
And you should force the students to do that as early as possible. Now, I would say both when it comes to teaching them Latin with translation and when it comes to teaching them conversational Latin, the same exact thing should be done. And you should focus on that when you're still using very short, simple sentences. Don't go into longer sentences until they're totally used to this, until you can ask them a question, putting the words in any order, and then they can answer you and put the words in any order in their answer.
Yeah, that underscores the importance of doing this in a very small scaled way, because if you try to jump into complicated sentences with mixed up word order, it's just going to be a complete mess.
Yeah, the students will not be able to manage it. I mean, this is what needs to be understood, that students can do it, but what you're asking them to do is actually something very complicated that their brains aren't used to doing. Yeah. Their brains are very much, English will probably be their native language, and so their brains are really set on the concept of the English sentence and how it's constructed. So word order determines the role that a word has in a sentence.
Yeah. Even for modern Romance languages, and for example, Greek, which I grew up with in my own home here, they're inflected languages still to this day, but of course they've adopted the more modern English word order, which is sort of defeatist in a sense, because the whole point of being an inflected language is so word order doesn't have to be so important in communication. But that's something that can get in the way sometimes.
Well, yeah, so most modern European languages have abandoned most noun inflection. Mm-hmm. And that means that it doesn't matter whether your native language is English or Spanish or French or Greek, the students will have the same issue. And that doesn't mean that they can't learn how to do this. And in fact, it's essential that they learn how to do this. It just means that it will take time, and the teacher will have to present things to them in the right way. It will have to be done gradually, with the teacher not moving forward until it's time to move forward. And there will need to be a real focus on getting the students used to Latin as it actually is, which is a language about endings, not about word order. And once that's done, once they start to get used to that, then you add other elements of grammar. Then you make the sentences more complicated. And at that point, the students will rocket ahead. You won't need, it's the first part that's the difficult part, I think.
Yeah, and just committing to doing it, too, I think, is a big step for a lot of people. And as I said at the top of the show here, this is something that we really want to do, is to take away these misconceptions. We're dispelling myths here, I think. Hopefully that's what we're doing. And again, one of those myths is you can't do this. You can do it. You absolutely can do it.
Yeah, we're the Latin Mythbusters.
Yeah. So that mean we get our own TV show?
I'm hoping so. I mean, we're starting with the podcast, but eventually, I'm hoping.
Today the podcast, tomorrow the world.
I think there are great things in store for us. But before we get to that, we should probably move on to something that maybe has been on the minds of a lot of listeners here. The issues that come into play when teachers decide they want to teach conversational Latin. And, I know, Kostas, you know what some of those issues are.
I do know what some of those issues are, yeah. And this actually has to do with something more deeply seated than simply teaching Latin in a spoken way to students, because there exists I would call it a deep fear for a lot of English speakers of even speaking any foreign language, let alone Latin. And the reason for this, I would say, is because there just simply hasn't been a need for a lot of English speakers to speak a foreign language. Now, Andrew, I know you've got a lot of things to say about this, so I'm just going to turn this one to you.
Well, I mean, let's see if I can think of any of them. There's no question that because English has become the world language, there isn't felt to be a real need in the English-speaking world for people to learn other languages. And so they just don't. There are very few native English speakers who end up learning other languages, which I think is a real shame.
It's a crying shame.
Yeah, and the thing is, students often don't start learning Latin until they're pretty far along. So most of the time, maybe they're freshmen in high school, and so they've had 12, 13 years of their lives in which they've never really had to learn a foreign language in any real way. This is in contrast to a lot of other countries, across Europe, where students start very young, learning multiple languages frequently.
Yeah. It's been like this for a very long time as well. I think, Andrew, I've spoken to you at least about this before. I told you that my own aunts and uncles and my own father grew up in a small village in an island in Greece, and even they took Latin when they were growing up, and they still remember some of it. It's really interesting. So, because my aunt, when we talk about what I do for a living, she'll always recite the same passage to me from a primer she had. I think it was Regina Rosa Samatin Silva. I believe that's what she always says to me. And, this is going back 60, 70 some years. And of course now, this is the year 2018, and there are English-speaking students that aren't learning foreign languages. I mean, what is going on here?
Well, so this is the problem. When they maybe are 13 years old and they start taking Latin, or they may be even older. I mean, a lot of students start even later than that. Maybe they're in college when they start Latin. And this may be the first time that they've seriously studied a foreign language. And because of that, all those years, there's been built up a real, not just a fear of speaking a foreign language, but a real belief that it's impossible, that they just couldn't possibly ever do it. And there's no question that a lot of students start out with that mindset. But I want to say at the same time that it doesn't take much to make them understand that, in fact, they can do it. Even though this exists among a lot of students, all you have to do is bring them along gradually and just have them do it. And if you start with very simple sentences, they will be able to do it and they'll be ecstatic. I can tell you from experience, they will be overjoyed that they're actually speaking another language because you, the teacher, have done something magical. You have allowed them to speak a foreign language. They never thought it was possible. You're a genius.
And you're their hero.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to be the hero teacher, the genius teacher, then you should teach your students how to speak Latin.
So what we're saying is, if you're into self-adoration, teaching languages is for you.
Well, you know that I am, Kostas.
All right. Well, before we go any further, we need to take a quick time out for a message here. And when we come back on the other side of this break, we'll talk more about some of the issues that exist here in teachers trying to teach their students conversational Latin. So we'll be right back right after this.
Thanks so much for listening to the Gray Fox Latin Teachers Podcast. I'd like to talk for a minute about why you should refer your students to Gray Fox tutors. First of all, flexibility. Our tutors and teachers are located in multiple time zones and all tutoring is done online. So there will always be a tutor available at the time you need. Number two, reliability. Gray Fox and Carmenta tutors have been in operation since 2008, employing dozens of tutors and teachers. We will not suddenly cancel tutoring sessions because our own midterms are coming. And three, we're the best of the best. Carmenta Online only hires the best teachers and tutors, and only the best and most experienced of these are promoted to the Gray Fox division.
Okay, we're back. And before the break, we were talking about something I like to call the curse of the native English speaker. Which has to do with, of course, the fact that a lot of native English speakers simply don't have a need to learn to speak a foreign language. But I think we pretty much dispelled that before the break. But now, of course, there are other issues that are endemic to Latin specifically. So Latin, obviously, is a very different language in terms of grammar from English to begin with. And there's a big difference between someone translating a Latin sentence and working with grammar in that way, and then having to use that same Latin grammar in a conversational setting.
Right. So there's no question that it's an easier thing for students to start speaking French or speaking Spanish, just two examples, because the grammar is essentially the same. The sentences are pretty much set up in the same way. And there are some small differences from English in French or Spanish, but they are very small. Well, the differences between English and Latin are really huge. I mean, to the point where there's some similarity. So it is true, adjectives in general do go next to the nouns they modify in Latin, which is something that happens in English as well. Prepositional phrases have pretty much the same order in English and Latin. They start with the preposition. So these things are the same, but the major elements of the sentence in Latin can go in any order. I mean, the language allows for that. That's how it's set up. And so the students need to learn a different way of using language, a different way of thinking about language. But I don't want to even say thinking about it, because I think that gives people the wrong idea. They need to learn a different way of intuiting language. Maybe that would be a better way to put it. They need to train their instincts so that they can use Latin in the way it was meant to be used. I mean, what do you think about that, Kostas?
I absolutely agree. I mean, just the necessity of having to use your brain differently. And I'm by no means a psychologist, but I would venture to say that there's a different part of the brain that is used to speak Latin maybe versus some other languages. Feel free to correct me out there, by the way, if I'm wrong on that, which I could be. I'm humble enough to admit that.
I don't even know how to talk about it. So a different part of the brain, or you use your brain in a slightly different way. There's definitely something different going on, no question.
Yeah, but the good news is, and if you're hearing this and you're getting bogged down and you're thinking, oh, this just isn't for me, this isn't possible, I have good news for you. All of these things can be overcome with practice. Number one, you've got to practice. You have to practice anything that you want to be good at. Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's everything. Now, the key, and this is obviously the case with anything, you want that practice to be efficient. So if the teacher is good and the teacher knows what he or she is doing, then that teacher will make the students practice efficiently so that they get better and better at it. And obviously, in the beginning, the practice will all happen in the classroom. But then later on, you want to get to the point where you're giving students conversation homework, where they have to speak to another student for a certain period of time. You want them to be speaking Latin as much as possible, because the more they do it, the better they'll get at it. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely no question.
Yeah, and of course, on last week's show, we talked about, Andrew, how you first got started with conversational Latin, communicating with that fella in Australia. And right. So that's how you got started, by engaging in these text chats back and forth in Latin. And so that's an excellent way for students to practice this.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. I have found that when you start giving students conversation homework, the best way to do it in the beginning is to have them do it with text rather than making it spoken. Mm-hmm. And this is something they can do on Skype, on Facebook, with another texting platform. But what we do is we have the students save the text conversation and then send it to the teacher. And that is the homework that the students have for the conversational part of the Latin class. Now, there's one other thing I want to mention here. There are obviously different approaches to introducing conversational Latin. And we have one approach. I know other people have a significantly different approach. So there are some teachers who believe in really teaching Latin through conversation. Mm-hmm. So just having conversation from day one and then having the students learn the grammar by speaking the language. Now, our approach is different, and I really do think, and this comes from experience, this isn't just wishful thinking, but I really do think our approach is more effective with the vast majority of students. That the problem with the conversation from the beginning approach is that a large percentage of the students can't handle it, and they end up dropping the class.
Yeah, and can we also say, just in reference to that, I think there is a small sect of students on whom that would work well, particularly younger students. And the reason is they have a tabula rasa. So, they're not polluted, let's say, by years of this faulty thinking in terms of other things.
Right. So that's a really good point. It actually does depend on the age of the students. So if we're talking about students who are definitely students who are under 10 years old, I actually do, and this sounds kind of odd, I actually feel that conversation from the beginning approach is the only good approach for those students.
Right, because they're not advanced enough to understand these more complicated grammatical concepts.
It is so tough to teach kids that age grammar. They just don't do it very well. But at the same time, they're very good at learning things intuitively in a way older students can't. So it's really appropriate that with younger students under 10, you take that strong conversational approach. I actually do feel that's the best approach for younger students. And this is odd, but at a certain age, and this happens between about 10 and 13 years old, the students rapidly switch over, and the full conversational approach doesn't work. They can't do it. They've been spoiled at that age.
Yeah, no, I have found that as well. I had a younger student not very long ago, and we were working out of Orberg, Lingua Latina per se illustrata, and we got to about chapter 7, and everything was going okay, but then we got there, and he started getting older, and it just wasn't working anymore, and we had to switch over. So I've seen this firsthand as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that's been my experience, that you can't teach younger students in the way that's best for older students, and you can't teach older students in the way that's best for younger students. Mm-hmm. And so if we're talking about students who are 13 and up, and I mean 13 up through senior citizens, I have found that the best way is to start with the grammar, start with translation, and that you've got to teach them enough grammar so that they're able to construct simple sentences on their own before you start getting them into conversation. But right at that point, you should start. So when they're able to understand all the elements in a sentence and to deal with them in a translation context, you should move immediately into conversational Latin. And my attitude is that should be a fairly large percentage of class time. And that, in fact, over time, it should become a bigger and bigger part of class. And the reason for that is not just that it's a great thing to be speaking Latin, it's a great thing to speak any language, but that the students will only know Latin at an advanced level if they're able to use it conversationally. It's the only way to get there. Mm-hmm. I can tell you from experience, it's really the only way to learn vocabulary effectively.
Yeah.
I mean, just 95% of students cannot just memorize word lists or flashcards. Doesn't work. They learn it and then they forget it. But if they learn vocabulary in a conversational context and they use a word 5 or 6 times, they'll know it forever. They'll never be able to forget it.
The only way to effectively learn vocabulary is to actually use it.
Yeah. And that sounds like an extreme statement to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But
because it's so radically different, from what's been done. I mean, as you said, in the past, students, and they still do, look at flashcards, whether they be real flashcards or virtual flashcards or e-cards or whatever they are, or they just sit there and they cram for an exam by memorizing these really long lists of words. And none of that is effective in trying to learn vocabulary.
Well, Kostas, if you ask any Latin teacher what the hardest part of Latin is for students, what's that Latin teacher going to say?
Almost certainly they're going to say memorization of vocabulary.
Exactly. And the reason for that is, even though there is a certain amount of complexity to it, the grammar is actually relatively simple when it comes to what you have to memorize.
Sure.
I mean, there are a limited number of rules that you have to know. And this is compared to an entire language of vocabulary that needs to be learned. The grammar is, I would say vocabulary, this sounds extreme, but it's 100 times as difficult as grammar. I mean, for a student to actually learn all that vocabulary, but it doesn't have to be. It can actually be very easy, just as with any other foreign language. the students can learn vocabulary through using it in a conversational context. And if you went and spoke to a Spanish teacher or a French teacher, Costas, what would that teacher say is the only way to learn vocabulary?
By speaking the language.
Yet somehow Latin is supposed to be different.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the insane thing. That is, if a lot of people, if they would just stop and think for half a second, I think they would see how unreasonable the non-conversational approach is, because what happens is students never learn vocabulary. And when they get to what is supposed to be an advanced level in the language, they still don't know vocabulary. So it's incredibly difficult for them. I don't see why it has to take a student hours to get through a paragraph of Latin.
No.
But that's how it usually is. And why is that? Well, if the student is, dealing with any sort of real text, that student will have to look up dozens and dozens of words just for that paragraph. So,
which is an enormous waste of time.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I have to say, I wasted an enormous amount of my life not speaking Latin, because I spent so much time looking up words, and I would look them up hundreds of times and never learn them because it just wasn't effective. There were certain words that I saw thousands of times, and I did learn those. But then there were many others that I just couldn't learn. I couldn't remember. And the reason why I couldn't do it was that I wasn't using it in conversation. It's just this magical thing, conversation, the way that it allows you to remember vocabulary.
Well, we're talking about Latin specifically here, but this can be applied to language in general. And there's such a larger theme behind all of this. I would say it's just not possible to thoroughly learn the vocabulary of any language without speaking it, because that's what language is. It's meant to be spoken with the lingua, with the tongue, not read from a list.
Absolutely. And so I would say that Latin teachers have the opportunity to make Latin 10 times easier for their students by integrating conversation and really making conversation a large part of the curriculum. It isn't possible in a lot of situations, but ideally that would be the case. But it's not just that. They have the opportunity to make Latin fun for students. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, I don't think students think of it as fun. They think of it as just another class they have to deal with. Yeah. Just as they have to deal with history and math and science, they have Latin. Well, a good Latin teacher has the opportunity to make Latin the student's favorite class. And that can be done pretty darn easily, I think.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to try and get everyone to calm down a bit. If anybody out there is just a little bit overwhelmed by what they've heard here, because we've said a lot of shocking things here today.
I am shocked by what we've said.
Yeah. And so this two-pronged approach is what has worked really well for us. So just so that we don't shock people too much and again, make them think that we're being extremists in any way, that we have the conversational approach and the more traditional approach combined for a certain group of students. It works really well for us. Something else that works really well is our Gray Fox Conversational Latin textbook, which we have written and which is available to all of you out there by visiting our Gray Fox website, grayfoxtutors.com. In the teacher materials section, we have a free download of the textbook available. And maybe we should tell them a little about this book, Andrew.
Well, I am proud of this book because I wrote it. And it is, this is just the curriculum that we've been using for years. I just took that curriculum and I put it into a textbook. And then I did my best to be as explicit about what the teacher needs to do at every stage. So obviously, there are a lot of Latin teachers who've never done this before. And a big part of why they don't do it is they just don't know how to. They need someone or something to guide them along. And that's the whole point of this textbook. Teachers can follow the textbook and teach conversational Latin effectively. It gives you the vocabulary that you need to use in each chapter. It gives you sample question and answer sentences that you should be using with the students. It tells you everything that you need to do. So with this textbook, I really don't think there's any reason for teachers to be afraid of moving forward with this.
No, and I think it's also important to say that this textbook is meant simply to be a supplement to the current text and the curriculum that you may be already using in your classroom.
Mm-hmm. So it's built to be integrated into your current curriculum, whatever that is. Whatever the textbook is you're using, there's no reason why you can't add this to that. So you may decide, and I think this is a reasonable way to proceed, if you have classes that are an hour long, you might decide to do 50 minutes of the curriculum that you already have, the textbook you already have, and then leave the last 10 minutes for conversational Latin. Or you might decide to do it at the beginning of class. Get students excited about Latin and involved, or you might want to do it throughout class. It's up to you, but there's no reason not to do it. I mean, it will be positive, even if you are only spending a small percentage of your time on this. I promise it will be very positive.
And so it's usually at this point that a lot of teachers wonder, well, what can I do to help myself be better prepared for this? What if I want to undertake learning conversational Latin for myself? And fortunately, once again, we're able to help with that. We offer free conversational Latin courses for teachers over Skype every week, and we are currently running our fall semester. It'll be in its second week this week. This is only for Latin teachers. It is not an open conversation group. It is an actual class. It is taught by one of us at the current moment, in which we take each person through our curriculum and do so at their own particular level. So it's not at the level of the entire class. It's at the level of each individual student. And this is not a freewheeling conversation hour. This is an actual class. It's so important to say that.
Yeah, because for a lot of teachers, the only experience of conversational Latin they've had is one of these events or conversation groups they may have participated in at one time or another. And what happened was everybody else was speaking Latin at a mile a minute. You had people who were speaking very advanced Latin, and it was just impossible for the new people to catch up. But that's not what this is. The people in the class are just as we described when we were talking about bringing students along very gradually, that's what happens in these classes. So if you join this class, if you're a Latin teacher and you decide to join our Skype class, you will start at the very beginning and then you will move forward at the pace that's right for you. And the whole thing is run by a teacher. I teach the class some weeks, Costas teaches the class other weeks.
Yeah, and everyone who comes always has a good time. So again, if you're looking for some camaraderie in this, just, hey, come and join one of our classes and come see for yourself. There's really no substitute for live interaction with this language, which is the point we've really been trying to drive home here today throughout the show. I think that's something that we're going to be doing certainly going forward, and continuing to get the word out and get the message out so people understand that Latin can be fun, and it's at its most fun when it's being spoken the way it was intended to be.
So, Costas, I have a question. What if listeners to this podcast want to get in touch with us with any comments or questions? What do they do?
I'm so glad you asked that, because we have a new way for our listeners to communicate with us. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to share with us, you may email us at podcast@greyfoxtutors.com. And Grey, and Grey Fox, by the way, is spelled with an E, GREYFOXTUTORS.com. Podcast@greyfoxtutors.com. Email us. Let us know what you think. And maybe we'll share your opinions here on the podcast.
I am really excited about hearing from our listeners. Unfortunately, this is, up till now, it's been just one way. But we really want to get the listeners involved as much as we can. Now, Costas, what do people need to do so that they know that our next episode of the podcast is out?
Another excellent question. So I would recommend subscribing to the podcast so that you are always aware of when we have a new episode. And if you happen to be watching or listening to us on YouTube, please click the subscribe button and then the little bell so that you'll get a notification when we put up a new podcast episode. And as always, of course, we invite you to check out our website for all of the free materials that we have for download for the teachers, and that includes everything we've talked about here today, the Conversational Latin textbook, which is free for all teachers, and the Conversational Latin class over Skype, which also is free for all Latin teachers who want to join.
Well, that all sounds like a great deal.
I think it is.
It's great when things are free.
It's a tremendous deal. If I do say so myself.
Yeah, and you do say that. I know. I want to say that as always, I had a great time talking to you today, Costas, and I'm looking forward to next week's podcast when we'll talk about a brand new, exciting topic related to teaching Latin.
I am as well. What will we think of next? Well, tune in and find out. So, Andrew, great to be with you again. Likewise, and great to have all of you out there as well. And I hope you'll tune in for the next episode of the Grey Fox Latin Teacher Podcast. Valete, everyone.
Valete, amici.